And these are not like, it's not just like oh, did you maybe see that UFO in the sky, which is kind of the comparison that some critics make. Like, did you, you guys saw that, right? Didn't you know, these are complex, sophisticated, important spiritual visions that they had. Again, audio, physical, and visual that they maintained for the rest of their life. Oliver Cowdery. And not only was it just Oliver Cowdery, but he shared this experience with David Whitmer. And it's practically the exact same experience that they shared. And then you go on and have Martin Harris have a very similar experience. And then you go
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Felt longer, actually. That's good.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And this is part 2 of my interview with Bridger Coburn. Bridger, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Yeah, so part 1, we talk a little about Bridger's story and his faith journey, growing up in the church, and a little bit about his faith crisis when he encountered criticisms and the CS letter, and then how he overcame it. And then we talk a little about his TikTok channel and YouTube channel, and just some general conversations about faith and interactions with critics. So I think it was a really good episode. So if you want to know more about Bridger's story and his faith journey, go back and watch part 1. In part 2, we're going to discuss some of the criticisms leveled against the church and its truth claims, some of these things you might see in different documents like the CS letter or like Letter for My Wife, Mormon Think. And we're just going to spend a few minutes on it, sort of talking about the criticism, maybe some of the faithful apologetic reconciliations or responses, and give our sort of take on where we might rank it in terms of the criticism. And obviously there's a bit of subjectivity here because everyone views these different issues differently. What might be a really big smoking gun problem, someone might not be as big a deal to someone else. We all reconcile differently. So this is kind of our opinions as well from people who have, thought about these things and a bit of research on it. So that's what we're planning to do. How's that sound?
Sounds great to me.
Yep. So you have a tier list, and what we're thinking of doing is just talking about each one for a few minutes. Some of these, I have to say my memory isn't the best. Typically on my channel, I explore a topic, and then as soon as I'm done with it, I forget. And then I move on to the next. But I will try to do my best to remember things, and Bridger can correct me if I am forgetting. And also some of these things I've not done the deep dive yet on my channel, but hoping to do in the future.
All right, let's see if this gets pulled up nice and good.
And I'm just going to turn off my phone just so I don't get any unwanted calls. I have to say, nobody ever calls me to want to talk to me, but then as soon as I'm having an interview, that's when I get calls.
Yeah, that's how it goes. And then let's see if. Okay.
We got Anachronisms. We got 19th century themes or influences for the Book of Mormon, treasure digging, different accounts for Joseph Smith's first vision, the Book of Abraham, polygamy, prophet, Freemasonry, and the witnesses. And we're hoping to cover this in an hour to an hour and a half or so, depending on time. Do you want to talk briefly about A to F and what that means? It's probably quite self-explanatory, but.
Yeah. So basically my thought is how difficult are these things to reconcile? A would be the most difficult. F would be the least difficult. It's not difficult at all to reconcile. In a way, it actually just strengthens your faith learning more about it. So, just ranking these. Obviously, these are speaking in big generals. So there's a lot of nuance in each of these categories, hundreds of little arguments underneath them. But just speaking in
specifically.
Yeah, but just speaking in generals, we'll rank each of these things, which are fairly common criticisms of the church.
Awesome. Let's see, where should we start? Do you want to start with the different first vision accounts?
Yeah, so I know you've done a lot of work here. What's your take on the different accounts of the first vision?
Yeah, so I didn't read all of the accounts until after I came back to the church. So there's 4 primary accounts. You got the 1832 written in Joseph's own journal. You got the 1835 account, which is recorded when he's meeting with what do you call that Matthews guy? What's his name? Robert Matthews? I can't even remember now. And then 1838, that's the one, the Pearl of Great Price, and the 1842 is the Wentworth ladder, and then there's 5 secondhand accounts. So like the gospel topics essay sort of views that Joseph gave different accounts of his first vision, at different times, in different contexts, and emphasize different details, depending on which account you read. So I think the two main criticisms, like there's lots of different obscure ones with the first vision, but I think the two biggest ones are how many beings did he see and what was his motivation for praying, and did that change? So when it comes to like, did he change his first vision from 1832 to 1835 and beyond, from seeing one being, the Lord, to seeing like multiple beings, the Father and the Son? And you could look at the 1835 account, because I believe one personage appears first, followed by another after. So if you look at the 1832 account, when it says like, the Lord opened the heavens and I saw the Lord, it's ambiguous. Is it just referring to one person as Jesus Christ, or could it be the Father appearing first, the Son after? So it depends on how you interpret that. But critics tend to focus on, well, all of Joseph Smith's like scriptural productions and all the writings show that he had a Trinitarian or modalistic view of God between like 1829 to 1834. So that's why, in the 1832 account, he only mentions the Lord, because he only believed in one being. And then his theology of God evolved from one God to multiple gods. And I found that really compelling whenever I first heard like Grant Palmer, Dan Vogel laid out, and I was like, this makes so much sense when they show scriptures like, like in Mosiah 15, where it talks about like Abinadi, talks about like the Lord God coming down, and he's the Father and the Son, the Father because of the Spirit, Son because of the flesh. Other scriptures like in the book of Ether talk about Jesus Christ being both the Father and the Son, and I was like, oh, like, man, this is almost like a smoking gun. My response would be to that is, as I've done more research, there are scriptures between 1829 to 1834, like in the Book of Moses and the Pearl of Great Price, which clearly show the Father and the Son as like separate and distinct. And even the Doctrine and Covenants, like I think it's section 45, where it talks about Jesus like advocating and like pleading our cause before the Father. And even other scriptures like in the Book of Mormon, or the visions of the 3 degrees of glory, where he sees Jesus on the right hand. I feel like there's lots of other scriptures that would go against that theory, that he was definitely modalistic or Trinitarian. So I feel like you need to take them all into account. So I can't say he definitely wasn't, but I feel like it undermines you saying it as matter of fact. That makes sense. So that'll be my thoughts on that criticism. And when it comes to, did his motivation for praying, did it change? Because in 1832, it's very much focused on like seeking forgiveness of his sins and redemption. And critics would say that he already came to the conclusion none of the churches were right from reading the scriptures. But then 1838, he's like, my object in going to inquire at the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, which church should I join. And I think if you just look at those two accounts, I understand why you would think, oh, like he's changing why he's going to the Grove of Trees. But I found whenever I read the 1835 account, and I think it's a second-hand account by Orson Pratt, that both motivations are spoken of, both him seeking to know which church to join and seeking and receiving forgiveness of his sins. So like, I think you could possibly interpret it as he's changing his motivation, but I think if you look at all the accounts together, I could grant the benefit of the doubt that maybe both motivations were at play, and he's maybe just emphasizing one over the other. So that'd be sort of like my general response to it.
Yeah,
Unless you have anything to add or correct
yeah.
or
My
clarify.
take is when I talk about the different accounts of the first vision, first and foremost, Joseph Smith is a real human being, and real human beings are complex. So if you watch the last interview we just did talking about my story, and then you watch the one I did with Saints Unscripted, and then you watch the one I did with Comeback Podcast, and then you watch the one I did with the guy who has the Spanish channel that I saw you were on recently.
Oh, Gustavo, have you been on his
Yeah,
channel?
yeah, I went on just yesterday.
Oh, I
So
love him. He's
he's
great.
great. He's fantastic. So if you
He's
watch
so
all of
nice.
those interviews, you're going to see a little bit of differences there in my story. That's a normal human thing to do.
Right,
When you're
right.
talking about significant spiritual events in your life, when you're talking about experiences you had, of course, over time, you're going to reinterpret those things as you live. It's just the past is subjective to the present. You view the past how you're currently living in the present. And when we look at Joseph Smith and how he's interpreting his first vision experience, we see that he includes or omits or gives more details based on what he's going through in his life at that time. That is a normal human thing to do. And it's not evidence against the first vision. It is evidence for that being a very real experience for
I
him.
remember Stephen Harvard talked about that, like his 1838 account. There's a big emphasis on like persecution. Like
Yeah.
him and the saints had gone through so much persecution, and that's sort of
Yeah.
interpretive memory, and that your current can impact your reflections of the past a little bit.
Yeah. So like when I'm just like when people talk about like, oh, look at these differences and like Joseph was motivated differently. I'm like, of course he was. He's a complex human being. Human beings have hundreds of factors that take them into a grove of trees to kneel down and say a prayer.
Mm-hmm.
If he omits or gives certain details on different reasons in a different account, that's a very normal human being thing to do. And it doesn't bother me in the slightest.
And even in his own 1838 account, he talks about like, which of the churches is right, and I think he makes a statement like, or are they all wrong together? But then later, when the Lord tells him not to join any of the churches, he's like, oh, it never entered into my heart. All of them were wrong. And somebody could say like, well, that's a contradiction in his own account. But it's understanding, well, you have to understand what Joseph was meaning there.
Yeah.
Like,
and like,
why would he be contradicting himself in his own account? It's just the way he's expressing it.
Yeah. And I know Jim Bennett had a thought on like entering into the heart and how that's used. That doesn't even bother me that much either, because again, Joseph's a complex human being. When you're talking about something that happened when you're 14, when you're 25, obviously you're going to interpret things a little bit differently and have, your timelines might not be exactly perfect.
Yeah.
So for me, the different accounts of the first vision, they don't bother me at all in the slightest. I don't know. What do you think?
I would probably put it somewhere maybe C, like middle of the road. I'm not fully persuaded by them, and I think there are some apologetic reconciliations, particularly like where the revivals in 1820 and getting into all that. I think there's good evidence that there was still like Methodist camp meetings and things going on. But even if you can defend all that, it still doesn't prove that he had a first vision. Like it still is a decision based on faith. But I think with some of those criticisms, when you dive deeper, looking at the different accounts, I feel like they're not as big a smoking gun as maybe what they were when I first learned about it.
Yeah.
To me,
the only thing that like maybe slightly bothers me with the first vision is the 1832 account, how it doesn't mention two personages.
Yeah.
That could maybe slightly bother me, but I can understand why Joseph wouldn't. And if we're talking about Joseph being a Trinitarian, well, Martin Harris hated the Trinity and he latched onto Joseph's teachings immediately. Yeah. So like, that wouldn't make any sense,
I would probably buy into the critic's theory. As I said before, I was persuaded by it when I looked and thought all his scriptural writings reflected Trinity or modalism. Then I was like, oh, okay, it makes sense. But when you realize that there's other scriptures that don't, and then as you said, Martin Harris was sort of opposed to the Trinity, and that was something that stood out to him about Mormonism. I just can't say it matter of fact, like he was definitely a modalist, and I think critics tend to say it very matter of fact.
Yeah. So if it was me, I'd probably put it in D, but I think it's you. It's your theology. If you want to put it in C, that's all. It's you. Let's do it there.
All right.
Okay. And then next up, what do you want to
do? Let's see. Should we go with treasure digging?
Yeah. Let's talk about about treasure digging.
Lump in that one, seer stones and folk magic. Do you want to sort of outline the critical perspective?
Yeah, so if you're asking a critic who is passionate about this issue, what they're going to say is Joseph grew up in a treasure digging environment. This idea that there was treasure under the ground and people could put stones in hats and they could look in the hat and they would find the treasure underground. And these treasures were often guarded by angels or spirits. And these treasure diggers were good at deceiving people. And they would say like they would have to do like these animal sacrifices and these rituals. And if people didn't do them right, then like the treasure would slip further into the ground. And they would draw parallels between this culture that it's pretty clear that Joseph Smith participated in. We don't know to what extent how he did, but it's pretty clear he participated in it. And they would draw parallels saying that to the Book of Mormon origin, how um, we Joseph found a treasure in the ground that was guarded by an angel Moroni. And then he goes on to translate the record, the treasure that he found, through the same process that he was using to apparently deceive people, is how they would pessimistically interpret it. How the seer stone in the hat method. Yeah, he
Yeah.
used the same method to translate the Book of Mormon as he used to deceive people in the treasure digging days.
Yeah, there was like
That's
problematic.
yeah, that's kind of the general criticism for treasure digging.
Yeah, yeah, because they would say like if he claimed to see buried treasure by looking into the seer stone and was involved in treasure digs, he was hired as treasure seer, but no treasure was found. Then was he conning them? Was he being a con man and deceiving
Yeah,
the people? And I have to say, like I think that is a fair criticism as I've looked at it. I think you made a good point that we don't know fully to what extent he was involved in treasure digging and this magical worldview. I think he did participate in it. There's people that claim that he did have this gift, like his mother, Martin Harris, Josiah Stoll said he described his property by looking into the stone. I think Martin Harris said he once found a pin in straw. So some people believed he really did have this gift to like see things like invisible to the natural eye as a seer. It's all speculation to like, did he genuinely have this gift? When did he receive it? I think Don Bradley links toward he might have received it at the first vision. I think there's a late account by John Alger where he talks about God touching Joseph's eye and then he could see the Savior. So like that could be possible. So I think there's kind of like two apologetic reconciliations you could go, and I'm not fully sure which. I'm sort of like torn between the two. So you could either view it that Joseph sincerely did have this gift, so when those people claim that he was able to find lost objects or whatever, that he really did have this gift, but when it came to treasure digging, that he was maybe misusing the spiritual gift, his spiritual powers, and that's why no buried treasure was found. And whenever he went to the hill to the gold plates, there's one account where I believe the angel reprimands him for his company with the money diggers. And I think when he first went to the hill, he sort of wanted to get the plates, and he thought about like, oh, I could get really rich off it. So I could see a possibility that maybe he was misusing his spiritual gift in treasure digging, and that's why no treasure was found. I think there's also a quote I remember in my series by Alva Hale, who's a brother of Emma, and the Hales they weren't friendly to Joseph, but I thought there was some credibility to the statement. He claims that Joseph said that all this peeping in stones to find buried treasure. Joseph was like, "This is nonsense," and I've been deceived in my treasure digging. But then he made a statement that, but seeing in the stones and the work as a seer, receiving revelations, that's a gift from God. And I think that's maybe the way Joseph sees it, and he moved away from treasure digging towards revelations and his work as a seer. So I think you could either take that view or just that Joseph Smith was immersed in folk magic. That was his culture, his environment. He was susceptible to it, and maybe he didn't have this gift, but it's all right. God was able to work through the stone and as like an aid or a prop for him to translate the Book of Mormon and receive revelations, and that believing in guarding spirits, guarding treasure, that almost prepared him to receive the angel in the plate. So I think some people might reconcile it that way as well. And I sort of see plausibility to either. What's your thoughts?
My thoughts is, so first and foremost, it's important to understand the context behind why we know about Joseph's treasure digging, and a lot of this is because the guy who went and gathered all of these accounts, a lot of these accounts for treasure digging,
Well, the
said, "I'm going to
Hurlburt
drink
affidavits.
Yeah, I'm going to drink Joseph Smith's blood," and then he goes and gathers a bunch of accounts suggesting that he was a treasure digger, and in many of these accounts, there are things that are verifiably just bullshit to excuse my language there, but
Yeah,
it's just not true. Then there are things that probably maybe are true, but if we even if we take the most pessimistic route as possible and we assume that all the ambiguous things we don't know are true, they date to when he was like 16 years old. He's like a sophomore in high school basically for our day. Like, so what? He's a sophomore in high school, running with the bad crowd, doing some stupid stuff, trying to make a buck. that doesn't bother me at the end of the day. Like if he's a normal teenager, he's going to do stupid stuff. That doesn't bother me. He obviously expressed in his first vision accounts that he felt like he had repenting to do
Mm-hmm.
later before the angel Moroni appeared. So it wouldn't bother me if Joseph was doing some dumb stuff with his treasure digging friends when he's a freaking 14, 15, 16, 17 year old. That's a normal teenager thing.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good point what you said about like some of the accounts as well, like particularly ones with animal sacrifice and things like, where it was a dog or a sheep killed in order to try to
Dog, chicken,
appease, yeah, the guardian
yeah.
spirit. I don't want to full on dismiss those accounts because they're even if they're antagonistic, but I am quite skeptical of them because these are come from people that would have had a bias against them. Like people can lie or embellish things. I think there's to me, I think there's good evidence that he probably was involved in treasure digging. I think the Glasslicker trial or hearing records probably support that. When he was working for Josiah Stowell, but a lot of it when it comes to what degree and what were his motives, I think we're all speculating to an extent.
Yeah. And I'm sure he was there when there was some animal sacrifices. Exactly what animal? It could be a dog, could be a chicken, whatever. I'm sure he was there when some of those things happened, and we don't know exactly what that looked like. I remember at Young Men's Camp they shot a bird, and I felt horrible, and I couldn't handle that they shot a bird. I was there though; doesn't mean I agreed
Yeah,
with what some of the guys in my Young Men's Quorum did shooting that little thing. So,
yeah. Usually,
um,
most lies aren't just complete inventions, but usually twisting something that might have happened.
yeah. So he might have been there when there was animal sacrifice. It's we don't know for sure. It depends on how optimistic or pessimistic you want to interpret those things. But again, if he's a teenager, we all do stupid stuff as a teenager. It doesn't really bother me. Um, and when it comes to like him using the same seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon as he did to try to seek for treasure, that doesn't bother me either because we know that God speaks to people according to their language, using things that they're familiar with. So if Joseph Smith is comfortable using a seer stone, and that's the way that he feels comfortable receiving revelation, it would not bother me if that's the avenue that God uses to help him translate the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, good point. So let's see, where are we thinking of maybe putting this one? I'm thinking, let's see, possibly B. It wouldn't be. I don't think it'd be quite A tier for me. But I can understand, the critics saying like, well, if no treasure was found, does that not show that he's a con man? So I think maybe B for me. What do you think?
Yeah, if it was me, I'd probably C, but we'll go with B for you.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
obviously a lot more higher on the critical spectrum. I'm
yeah,
more of a doubter than you.
yeah, which is that's
We're
fine.
more
I'm
generous
fine
to the
with that.
critics.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that's good. B
But
B
that's
is
the
good.
thing. We all sort of, it's subjective, isn't it? What bothers some people more than others.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
have to
I'm
compromise on some things. Let's see. Do you want to go to the Book of Mormon next?
19. You want to do 19th century or anachronisms?
Either. Where do you want to go?
You can do anachronisms and then
All right, let's
do
do it.
19th century after. So
Okay.
anachronisms. This is since it's just it's just very broad. So this could include material based anachronisms: horses, goats, wheat,
Elephants,
metallurgy,
metals.
elephants. We also could include biblical anachronisms, which I think is the strongest argument against the church today. I don't know if you want to include that in here, but that's like
Like
Deutero
textual ones, like
Isaiah.
New Testament passages,
Um,
Deuteronomy, Isaiah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, those are huge. And that also could archaeology could be included underneath this. DNA could be included underneath this. Yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah.
things that could be included, which again they're very greatly. So we're speaking in general here. Like I think DNA is F, but I think biblical anachronisms are S or like top tier. So
Mm.
kind of we're gonna have to find a balance here, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. So for the physical anachronisms, I think in a nutshell, apologetic response is that we've not excavated everything there is archaeologically. So what is an anachronism today may not be a definitive anachronism and that there's been less and less anachronisms over time. So that's one apologetic. Or that some of these animals, it could be either a lone shift or a translator's anachronism. So some ancient civilizations or peoples, for example, I think it was the Greeks who, when they saw a hippo, they called it a river
Water
horse. So it's
horse.
like, yeah. Or in the King James Bible, the translators translated oil lamps into candlesticks, even though candlesticks were anachronistic, but it was more relevant to their audience. So you could allow for that possibility as well. Maybe it's not a pig, but maybe it's a peccary, or maybe it wasn't a sheep, but a mountain sheep. But that was the word that either Joseph, or as the translator chose, or as the Nephi authors wrote. I can understand, like, whenever I did that video, there's times where I'm like, okay, I can understand if you're making an excuse for every single one, like, okay, it's not this, because I could see why to a critic they might feel like, does anything mean anything? If that makes sense. But I think you do need to take into account that we've not discovered everything there is to discover, and that this is translation. So that's sort of my view. The physical material anachronisms aren't as devastating to me, even when I first was in my faith crisis. I think some of the textual ones, like, New Testament passages, what's Paul doing in the Book of Mormon, would that have been on the gold plates, or Deutero Isaiah is probably one of the biggest ones. I think a lot of it depends on your view of the translation, and I would lean more towards a functional translation, sort of like Frank Gardner's view. I also respect Blake Oster's expansionist as well, but I don't think Paul was word for word on the gold plates, but it was a functionally sufficient translation, and that Joseph Smith was using language and vocabulary that he had to clothe the translation, and that's the way I make sense of New Testament passages. And when it comes to Deuteronomy Isaiah, I allow room for the possibility that it could have been a small window, it could have made it on the brass plates, and that it was just later redacted by scribes and such. I know the biblical consensus would be it wasn't written till long after. So yeah, I think that Deuteronomy Isaiah is probably one of the bigger issues.
Yeah, I agree. And when I approach like anachronisms in general, I think it's important to understand very, very first what the Book of Mormon actually is. What assumptions are we imposing on the Book of Mormon? And that we have to understand that first. So I say the Book of Mormon is an ancient ethnocentric Mesoamerican record that was compiled by a prophet historian who then gave the record to his son, traveled a couple thousand miles up to New York, buried them in a hill, and then was translated by a 19th century farmer using his limited vocabulary and context to translate the record. So there's a lot in there that we can pull out and discuss. But if we understand that that is what the Book of Mormon is, then we should expect there to be things in the Book of Mormon that aren't actually historical. For example, we could say a sword, a metal sword, or when it talks about swords in the Book of Mormon, and how it could be. Of course, Joseph doesn't know what a malaquittal is, so we're not going to see the phrase malaquittal in the Book of Mormon. Um, and and when we assume that the sword is a reference to like a steel sword, that would be anachronistic. But if we approach the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith is a translator and not just a reader, which is a lot of an assumption that a lot of people make that he's just a reader.
Mm-hmm.
But if he's a translator, his language and context is going to be all throughout the Book of Mormon. Then we can interpret sword as a malaquittal, no longer is an issue. And we could use that for the vast majority of anachronisms in the Book of Mormon can be dealt with just like that. The understanding that the Book of Mormon is translated through Joseph Smith's context, his expectations, personality, context, limited vocabulary, all of those things are going to play in a role in the creation of the text. Of course, we should expect there to be 19th century themes, things that are out of place at face value for the time and place of and the text is supposed to take place. So for a
I
lot of
think as well, when it comes
anachronisms,
to
yeah,
anachronisms, for me personally, if there is no evidence in favor for the Book of Mormon, then I might lean with the critics and say, like, oh, these just seem like excuses. But whenever I've looked at old
yeah,
world geography, Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert, Nahum and Bountiful correlating really well with the text of First Nephi, or some geology in the Book of Mormon, or some of the convergences in Mesoamerica that I talked about with Frank Gardner, read in his work, and just the sheer complexity of the book, or some of the ancient elements that scholars have pointed to. I sort of look at that, and then I look at anachronisms through that lens that maybe it's not definitive. If there was no evidence in favor, then I probably think, okay, this is just apologetic excuses.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you there. And like when we also think about like Mesoamerica and how we've excavated and professionally surveyed less than 1% of ancient Mesoamerica, and
That was a revelation
remarkably,
whenever I first learned that. I didn't
yeah,
know that. I think it
like
was either right before I came back to the church or just after, and I was like, really, what?
yeah. And I'm not saying that to say, oh, we're going to find the rest, because I don't think we're going to find, like, there's plenty of the things in the Book of Mormon. I think they're just Joseph's language. But when I say that, remarkably, even with only 1% of like knowledge when it comes to Mesoamerica, we can still find so many ways. Like your interviews with Brant Gardner, we can find so many ways the text converges and corresponds with that setting, with us only having that much limited knowledge. I think that is great evidence for the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, and definitely not against it, given that we can parallel so much with it,
Yeah,
Mesoamerica.
there's kind of like a different approach. Like there was a quote in his book, and I think it said, instead of looking for the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, he talked about looking for Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon, and how do things with either geography or the civilizations or the culture, how does that align? Does it fit that time and place, the context? And there are some things in there which, to me, were just pretty amazing convergences or correlations. And I felt like the geology as well, and the destruction in Third Nephi and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes correlated very well with that geographical model. So to me, like I feel like I take that evidence into account when I look at some of these anachronisms or criticisms.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I'm with you there.
so in terms of ranking, because it's so generic, I think it's a tough one. I would maybe you think I'm being too generous, but maybe a B, just because I think anachronisms can be like, ooh, especially some of the textual ones.
Yeah. If we're talking about biblical, I would obviously put it up here at the top.
Yeah,
But if we're speaking in general, um, yeah, probably B or C. It doesn't really, archaeology, I think, is an F. I think there's great archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. But if we're talking about anachronisms,
yeah,
probably right around B,
okay.
if we're taking it holistically.
Already, we do 19th century themes, and this kind of like goes into what we're saying about translation. But I think the main critical arguments or theories is that there's a lot of 19th century influences or elements in the Book of Mormon. They would point to King James Bible passages, you've got Old Testament passages like Isaiah chapters, New Testament passages, so like Jesus' sermon at the temple being very similar, nearly identical to the Sermon on the Mount with a few changes. You've got passages from Paul, and they would point to like anti-Masonic rhetoric and the Gallatin robbers and secret combinations. They would point to similar sounding like sermons or conversion experiences to that of like Methodist ministers, and is he just imitating what he's hearing at revivals? They would talk about maybe View of the Hebrews or the Mound Builder myth being sort of like he's borrowing that for the Nephite and Lamanite narrative, and then Joseph Senior's dream resembling Lehi's dream. And they would probably say like this is just him taking things from his milieu, his environment, with his own creative genius, and this shows that it's a 19th century text and how he did it. So what's your? Well, I've done a final video sort of giving my analysis on the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on the 19th century?
19th century themes, when people bring that up, I'm just like, duh. Of course. Obviously. There's going to be 19th century themes in the Book of Mormon. If we take Joseph Smith as a translator, and again, not as a reader, then of course we're going to see his expectations, his context, his personality, his vocabulary. All of those things are going to be in the text. That is just simply how translation works. That is where the conversation is. And I think, yeah, Joseph Smith's a translator. The words that appear on the stone, however that came across, it's Joseph Smith's language. His
Yeah,
brain's the one making that happen.
yeah,
So all if
I would lean with that.
so I think for me it's a total non-issue. It does 19th century themes in the Book of Mormon. I'm like, we should expect those things to be in the Book of Mormon because again, Joseph Smith is the one translating it.
Hmm. Yeah, because I think particularly when it comes to King James Bible passages or Protestant sounding revivalist language, I think you can really attribute that to Joseph is the translator. It's a 19th century. It could still be a translation. It doesn't mean, oh, it's a 19th century text if you can find
Yeah.
19th century elements or phrases or his own vocabulary in it. I can maybe see a little bit more strength to some of the arguments, but then I feel like some is, I wouldn't say speculative, but it's like finding parallels, like the secret combinations in the Gallant and Robbers. That's coming from anti-Masonic rhetoric, and it's like, okay, maybe, but like it's not just the Masons that are referred to as having these secret combinations, but lots of
Yeah.
societies throughout history. So yeah, I would probably put it more as like a C or a D for me. Where would you put it?
Oh, I put it in F, but
Oh, you put it in F. Okay, well, maybe
I
no.
put it in F because it. But no, we'll put it in D, all right, in the middle. Um, but yeah, it just comes down to how you interpret translation. How I interpret translation, it is just a non-issue, complete non-issue for me. Um, I to rant a little bit. I kind of hate the conversation about tight versus loose translation because it presents kind of an overly simplistic binary for me. I think no
Yeah,
matter how tight we assume the translation is, we can assume that each word was spelled out on the rock, which I don't think exactly, but I do think the rock had words on it. But if each word is spelled out on a rock, word by word, no matter what, it's still Joseph Smith's vocabulary going onto the rock, and his brain is the one forming those words and phrases.
yeah, is
So
it like
no
a
matter what
literalist
we
equivalent
say,
or functional?
yeah, no matter how tight we want to assume tight is a word, right? And no matter how tight we assume it is, it's still Joseph Smith's expectations, vocabulary going through. So I just hope members can comprehend that of course we're going to see, no matter how tight we assume it, is Joseph Smith's translation.
Yeah, no, and I think as well, like for me, I don't know if I could hold to tight or like word for word literalistic equivalent translation. That was the way I viewed it before. So whenever I learned that there is even some small changes to subsequent editions in the Book of Mormon, or like here's Paul being nearly quoted verbatim, or like hey, these conversion experiences in the Book of Mormon sound quite similar to people at revivals. I couldn't reconcile that with a very tight word for word literalist equivalent translation. Uh, but it was easier to account for that Joseph Smith, his role as the translator, it's his vocabulary, it's his language.
Yeah. And Egyptian and English are two vastly different languages. You can't just put Egyptian and then write to English. It takes a lot of working with the vocabulary to work it out. And again, if we're taking Joseph Smith as translator, that vocabulary between Egyptian and English is going to be Joseph's. It's not going to be anyone else's, it's Joseph's.
Yeah.
And Joseph was given the gift of translation. He wasn't just babysat and it wasn't translated for him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I would probably lean with that. And I think the witnesses who claim, I think it's like Emma Smith, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, maybe a couple others that they almost viewed it as like an inerrant translation, that it was the stone that was doing the translation. He was reading it and they couldn't move on unless it was written down perfectly. And the original manuscript would kind of debunk that view. But this is my
Yeah.
personal opinion or view. I believe they had this assumption or this view because they saw Joseph correct the spelling of names, for example, and then
Yeah,
they probably
names are
assumed that
important.
it was like that for the whole text. But we know like the grammar wasn't good. There was
Yeah.
misspellings, but I think, and obviously it makes sense why names, if you're translating a story, why names would be more tight because they're very important to the story. But
Yeah.
the rest I would see is functional.
Yeah, I agree. But even if we assume that like every word was spelled correctly and it was just Oliver and Joseph who just made mistakes in that process, it's still Joseph Smith as a translator. And I need to hammer that down to anyone who's engaging with the Book of Mormon. It will always and has been always Joseph Smith as the translator. He was given the gift of translation. He wasn't just a sock puppet repeating exact. It wasn't an angel who translated it and then gave it to Joseph Smith.
Royal Scotsman
Joseph
would
Smith.
agree with you, disagree with you. 16th
I don't care
century,
if
16th
I don't
century
care if
English.
he disagrees with me. I'll beef with him right now. Um,
I'll bring him
but
on.
yeah, let
We'll
me
actually like
debate
to do an
him.
interview with Scott. I have read through some of his work, and I don't want to be dismissive. But whenever well, maybe I shouldn't bring up this, but whenever I was trying to bring up to him, what about all these 19th century elements? I don't think he appreciated me almost trying to push on his theory a
Yeah,
little bit. But hey, maybe I'll get him on. But to me, I see a lot of Joseph Smith's language a 19th
Yeah.
century element, it'd be very hard for me to ignore that and just say, oh, it's a 15th, 16th century translation. I think what I've noticed with some people I've interviewed, and I've not called them out on this in the interview, but I've sort of thought about after, is they've sort of begun with it's a 15th, 16th century translation, tie it word for word. It's not Joseph's language. But then whenever I brought up certain criticisms, they've kind of moved towards the loose. Whereas I think you need to
Yeah.
be more consistent with your
Yeah.
theory.
There's an issue in apologetics right now with with the translation theories and how they take like both. You can't take both. You gotta take one. I think the 16th. I think that's compelling. But if you're translating between Egyptian to English and you're using a farmer to do it through his expectations, context, and limited vocabulary, of course you're going to see some ambiguity in the language there. So yeah, if 16th century English rolls in coincidentally because of how complex the Egyptian to English through a farmer is, that doesn't bother me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, all
Okay.
right, well, you want to go to the next one?
Let's see. Do you want to go to witnesses?
Witnesses. Just kidding.
Already.
I think the arguments against the witnesses, like, I don't want to be mean to the people who are making those arguments, but it almost makes me laugh some of the times with the critics' arguments against the witnesses. I don't know. You've done the interview with Don Vogel, which is a great interview. I love that one on the witnesses.
I felt like Dan, in fairness to him,
engaged.
if I lose my faith tomorrow, I would probably have to go with his theory. I think it's the best, most well thought out explanation for the witnesses. And yeah, critics would tend to focus on, in my view, a few second, third hand statements that, it was spiritualized, or, they had this very magical worldview, very visionary mindset. They hallucinated. They were all just, superstitious religious dupes. The 8 witnesses, they didn't actually see and handle. It was covered in a cloth. And I understand if you just look at a couple of those quotes, but one of the things that was quite enlightening to me, whenever I first was in my faith crisis, I'd only read the official testimony of the 3 and the 8. And then whenever I read the statements that critics were pointing to, I was like, oh my gosh, like I interpreted the official testimony in light of these statements. And I thought, like, okay, they have this really visionary mindset, and Martin Harris seems like a bit of a nut, and can we take them seriously? But as I've done more research, there's so many first and second hand statements from the 3 witnesses that, like, they reaffirmed they saw the angel, they saw the plates. It wasn't a hallucination or a trick or a delusion to them. Even Martin Harris, like, so many times where he's like, as sure as you see my hand, I saw the plates. Like, and they all reaffirmed it to the day they died. Even after all 3 of them leaving the church, Oliver and Martin came back. David never did. And I think you can't deny, like, they're certainly sincere to me. Like, it's faith whether or not we believe. And also, like, that all 3 of them had the same sort of mass hallucinatory experience, and Joseph prophesied if he wrote the Book of Mormon that they would see the plates. It just seems kind of improbable, and then he was able to trick the 8 witnesses with his own set of fake metal plates. So it's not like impossible, but I always find that kind of like as amazing or miraculous as maybe there was an angel in plates and he was telling the truth. So yeah, for me, when it comes to the witnesses, I'm just not convinced by the metallurgical fraud, mass hallucination theory. And I just feel like they're very sincere, in their 20s.
Yeah, I agree. And like, if you were to press me on like, what is the number one evidence for the truth claims of the church that Joseph Smith was a prophet? And I think that's a hard question, because obviously it's built around thousands of factors and a ball rolling bigger and bigger and bigger and more pieces tying together. But the number one evidence for Joseph Smith as a prophet, I would say, is Oliver Cowdery, specifically his testimony. Not only is he a witness of an audio, visual, physical witness of the Book of Mormon, which is, I can't even begin to explain how hard that would be to trick or have him hallucinate, which is insane, but that's the theory. But like, he's an audio, visual, and physical witness of the golden plates of the Book of Mormon, but he's also a witness of the priesthood restoration, another audio, visual, and physical touching on the head experience. And he's a witness in the Kirtland Temple.
Right.
And if you suggest that he's a co-conspirator, well, he called Joseph out over perceived moral failures. He met Joseph after the Book of Mormon already started. The process has already started, so why would Joseph let him in on it? Just the co-conspirator argument is terrible. But I don't know
Yeah,
if it's
I
any
feel like
more
the
terrible
conspiracy doesn't
than
hold up, especially because
no.
they all left, and some of them viewed him as a fallen prophet, and they kept
Yeah,
reaffirming till the day they
yeah,
died. Like I think it's even most critics, serious critics, would say that they were sincere but duped, sincere believers but duped.
yeah, and like yeah, Oliver, and he just he continued reaffirming to the day he died. He reaffirmed on his deathbed, and these are not like it's not just like a oh did you maybe see that UFO in the sky, which is kind of the comparison that some critics make. Like did you guys saw that right? Didn't you know these are complex, sophisticated, important spiritual visions that they had. Again, audio, physical, and visual that they maintained for the rest of their life. Oliver Cowdery, and not only was it just Oliver Cowdery, but he shared this experience with David Whitmer. And it's practically the exact same experience that they shared. And then you go on and have Martin Harris have a very similar experience. And then you go on and have people like um, Mary Whitmer have an experience like that.
Sure,
And then
yeah,
you
yeah.
have,
She
and then you
saw
have like
the angel.
the eight witnesses. You have Josiah Stoll. You have Emma Smith. You have people in the Smith home who are like they feel the edge of the plates and hear them rustle, and suddenly it just becomes like to make an argument against Joseph Smith. Not only does he have to be a master trickster to be able to cause hallucinations that the world has never seen anything to the likeness of, but he's also going and picking the smartest people he knows. Oliver Cowdery was a very well respected and intelligent man. Um, very respected in the community. He decides to pick Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer. Maybe Martin
He was
Harris,
a
you could make
school
a case
teacher
there.
and later became a
But
lawyer.
yeah, you're picking Oliver Cowdery and David. Why would you pick the smartest people you know to be able to, and then say like, oh yeah, in the Book of Mormon, he's like, I'm going to convince, or we're going to have three witnesses. So he has the confidence to suggest that he's going to get three witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Then he picks the smartest people he knows, and then he pulls off one of the craziest hallucinations we've ever seen in the history of the world to be able to trick Oliver and David into doing it. And then he does it unconsciously with Mary Whitmer. And then he also has these fake plates that dupe pretty much everyone that interacts with them, who comes around him, including the eight witnesses and the plenty of unofficial witnesses that interact with them. It just becomes crazy to me to make an argument against the authenticity of the witnesses when you tie it all together.
Yeah, no, I'm not persuaded by it. And it's funny because I have a family member who has left the church, but whenever talk about the witnesses and the gold plates, and I talked to her about Dan Vogel's theory, which I think that's the way you would have to go. I think most serious critics would lean with his theory, and she thought like, no, I don't believe Joseph made his own set of tin plates, and I'm just like, well, then what's your explanation? She was like, I just don't think there were any. I was like, well, the problem is there's so many statements from people that there was some plate artifact. Like, I feel like that is a fact that there were plates. And
Yeah.
she just didn't find it uh, plausible whatsoever that Joseph went, to the hill or to the woods and made his own set of metal plates. And I was like, well, yeah,
Yeah.
I lean with that, but that's kind of where you would have to go, with that theory.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. And how the weight of the plates would match like a set of Timbaga plates that would come out of Mesoamerica. Like it all just ties together in reality
Mm-hmm.
so well. And when you try to tie it together in a secular way, it just like it just becomes crazy to me. It doesn't make the only reason why is if someone's like completely against God being a possibility is the only reason I could see someone rejecting the witnesses
Yeah.
is if like for whatever reason they really don't want to believe in God, then I guess it's fine to reject the witnesses. But
I
for
think I
me,
think critics
it's
are probably
just
privileged the
yeah,
Stephen Burnett quote above all others, and I can understand when you read that quote talks about like Martin seeing with spiritual eyes, and it was all in vision or imagination, implying he didn't really see it, and none of the eight witnesses did either. But whenever you look at like their first-hand statement, they're just very emphatic. I saw and handled the plates, like the eight witnesses. So I tend to interpret these second or third-hand statements in light of their primary statements, and I feel like probably over 90% are faith promoting, like faith affirming.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
oh yeah,
like if you're going to be transparent about the data, then you shouldn't just cherry pick a few, but you should look at them all. And when it comes to like spiritual eyes or vision, like that's a term in the scriptures is spiritual eyes. It doesn't mean that it wasn't real. And I think there's a statement from I think it's David Whitmer where he's like, well, like of course we were in the spirit when we saw the angel. Like you couldn't see an angel without being in the spirit, but we were in the body as well, and it was as real as anything else. So like even though they might have referred to it as a vision, that doesn't mean that it was in their mind they imagined it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm with you there. So I don't know. What do you want to rank it?
well, probably F, I would say. Like I remember
That's
whenever I did the
right.
last tier list, I put it, I think in uh, D. I think our tier list was. But I think if you're taking into account, like I think the witnesses are evidence in favor, then I think that would probably balance it more to an F.
Yeah. Want to do Book of Abraham next?
All right, let's do it.
So transparent. I would put this one in S just off the start. Book of Abraham's a problem. It's probably with biblical anachronisms probably the strongest argument against the truth claims of the church. That said, usually there's about a couple ways to reconcile it. The issue with the Book of Abraham, just quickly, is that Joseph Smith got this papyri. He translated it. We've portions of it were burnt, but we've since had the surviving fragments have been translated now by modern Egyptologists, and it does not match the Book of Abraham in any way, shape, or form. So that's the issue. The apologetic interpretations are one, which is practically no one takes, is that modern Egyptologists are wrong.
That's
Two,
true. Yeah, nobody really takes that
nobody.
one.
There's a few people that take it, but they're more on like the
More in
you
denial, I'd
know
say.
more in the Heartlander
Yeah.
side of things. But the two routes people go with the missing scroll theory. So when we look at the witnesses' statements of the papyri of the Book of Abraham, we see long scrolls that were translated from, and that's not what we have surviving to this day. There's things I like about
The
this
Book of
theory, and I
Abraham could
think
be on the missing
yeah,
or the scroll that was burnt.
yeah. And there's things I like about it, but my issue is if you were to ask me just transparently, if the portions of the scroll never got burnt and were still in the museum, and if modern Egyptologists translated that, would the Book of Abraham be on there? If you asked me that question, I would say probably
Probably not.
not.
Well,
And
yeah,
so
because
that's
if it's a
why,
common funerary text, yeah, the 200 BC,
yeah.
Book of Breathings,
And
Book
like
of the
I
Dead.
get there's some evidence that the guy who the scroll is from, and I can't remember his name, or like
Or
Ham maybe, or yeah, that he was a priest of Thebes, and sometimes they would sometimes carry ancient writings with them, and so maybe you could make an argument there.
yeah, like it's
But
possible, but
yeah,
there's
but
not
I'm
really
like,
evidence to support it.
there's never been a writing of Abraham discovered outside of the Bible anywhere. And the fact that it somehow just shows up in Palmyra with Joseph Smith, you couldn't convince me of it. So I take the catalyst theory where, same thing with like the Book of Moses and D and C. I can't remember what section it was, but
Oh, the Parchment
yeah,
of John.
the Parchment of John, where Joseph is excited about these papyri. He believes they're from Abraham, and again, as he's seeking revelation, it comes out and he translates writings of Abraham that aren't on the papyri, but that but are actually like he translates Abraham's writings, but they don't match the papyri
Hmm.
because those are his
Served
expectations of the
as a
papyri.
catalyst. Yeah,
Yeah,
and for
there's
me,
issues with that because then it comes up with like trickster God and stuff, and that's a philosophical question we
yeah,
probably don't
and
need
I
to
know
dive into
people
here. But yeah,
like for example, Mike from LAS discussions would frequently say, it's indistinguishable from fraud. So my view, and I think that's a fair, valid point. My view. So whenever I came back to the church, I remember I listened to John Gee, some of his interviews in like Fair Mormon conference, and I held to the long scroll theory. That was my view. And so I've not dived super deeply into this, but around like a year and a half ago, before I started my channel, I was listening to more episodes and podcasts about the Book of Abraham. And I remember listening to some of Dan Vogel's series. And what kind of shifted me away from the long scroll theory is the Egyptian grammar and alphabet. And it seemed very apparent to me that some of the characters which are on the fragments of papyri that we have, they put it in a column, and then there would be a text that somewhat resembled what was in the Book of Abraham. And we know from like journal writings of Joseph that he was working on the alphabet and grammar. I don't believe that this was just W. Phelps and his scribes leading the project, and they were doing, what was it, reverse engineering. So it seemed quite apparent to me that he believed he was doing a translation of the the characters on the papyrus that we have, and that he believed it was literal translation. So that for me was quite a aha moment where like I don't think the long scroll theory holds up for me in
Yeah.
my view. And the catalyst theory, I know people would say, well, that's just kind of out of convenience. You know, he's saying it's a translation, and then you're like, okay, it doesn't match. And you're like, well, it's still inspired, it's still a revelation. You can't prove that.
Yeah.
One of the things, as I've read and researched, is people would point to some of the themes in the Book of Abraham resembling things in ancient texts or ancient documents about Abraham, like the Apocalypse or Testament of Abraham, talking about him, being sacrificed or teaching astronomy to Pharaoh. And there's things when I look at that, you're like, okay, well, maybe there is some ancient things that possibly he could have been channeling then in ancient texts. If there's some things in antiquity, or people have pointed to like the is it plain of Olashem, and they found like Ulasum as a possible match. The only issue I have with, because I remember watching a video, and I think this might have been on Saints Unscripted, and I love Saints Unscripted, but this is probably one bit of apologetics I'm not a huge fan of. Is
Was
they
it David
showed,
Snell's?
yes, and I think he
It
does a
was
great
on
job.
Evidence Central, I think.
Okay, maybe yes, because he talked about evidences on that, and I think some of them are interesting to take into account. But something I'm not a huge fan of is when it comes to the facsimiles, when
They're like, oh, well,
apologists
look at
would
these
point.
two things they got right out of these 40.
Yes, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
like that. Like, look at the crocodile. He says is like the god of Pharaoh, and yeah, that seems to match. Or the four canopic jars being the four quarters of the earth. Look at these hits. He's
Yeah.
inspired, but then it's like, but look at all these misses, and I find that quite misleading if you just want to focus on the 2 or 3 hits, but
Yeah.
ignore all the misses. I feel like that's not good apologetics. So when it comes to the Book of Abraham, I
Yeah.
probably have been forced from the evidence to go more with the catalyst theory, but I'm going to dive deeper into it. I think probably
Yeah.
it's the text itself, and comparing it to
Yeah.
ancient documents attributed to Abraham is probably the way to go in looking for some evidence. But yeah, I would acknowledge, like, if the Book of Abraham was the only scriptural text that Joseph Smith produced and there was no other evidence to support, it would be very detrimental to my faith. And I totally understand why somebody would say, well, it's not a right translation, field translations,
Yeah.
he's a false prophet. Like, I get it.
Yeah. I'm with you there. And like yeah, I, the question of like the catalyst, like it is, I would be transparent and say it is like out of like necessity, but only
Yeah.
because like we have things like the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, which are an unbelievably compelling evidence for Joseph. And the counter arguments aren't great. We have things like convergences between the Book of Mormon and the Old World and the New World, which are unbelievably strong evidences. So, yeah, the Book of Abraham requires us to be on defense, and that's part of it. Like I said in like the last episode, the evidences go both ways, and the Book of Abraham, to be transparent, goes the way of the critics. That's just how it is. When it comes to the catalyst theory, again, it's a question of philosophy and why God would do what he did. And I have my own thoughts, so we'll probably won't dive into it here, but it is a question of philosophy with the catalyst theory. Um, and then with the facsimiles, I also think that Joseph is allowed to interpret the facsimiles in whatever way he sees fit, and it's okay.
Yeah, like it's not like literal translations.
Yeah, they're just drawings, and so if Joseph wants to interpret the drawings however he wants, that's okay. If it, yeah, that's how I view it. So I would say Book of Abraham is S tier. I don't know. What do you think?
You have an S tier. Is that the one at the top?
Or A tier? Sorry.
Oh, A. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I'm hoping like to do a series on it. And I want to interview people like Carrie Milstein or Stephen
Smoot.
Smoot, or maybe even get John Gale, like people who have done a lot of
Get
research on it.
get Givens back. Do Givens for that if you could.
Well, yeah, he's written a book on. I want to read it
He's
as
like
well. Book of Abraham. I
he's one
think
of the
he's more.
biggest. He's a catalyst guy, and everyone
Yeah.
else is a lot missing scroll, which I think would be good to get a really good catalyst guy on here to.
Yeah, I know people that work in the Joseph Smith Papers project, like Robin
Yeah,
Jensen, or would be more
Brian
in the catalyst
Hoglet or however.
camp.
Yeah,
But I felt like the Joseph Smith Papers project very, in my view, clearly showed to me that one, the Book of Abraham wasn't all produced in 1835, and that Joseph was involved in the Egyptian alphabet and grammar. That
Yeah.
that seemed quite apparent to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, something to
And
look forward to
with the
in the
Book of
future.
Abraham, I do want to say I think there is some very compelling evidence. It is the Book of Abraham text is historical, and it's inspired. I also think if we look at Joseph's motivations, if it's a fraud, a lot of his behavior doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think there's some great questions we can ask critics on that, and like why he's letting everyone dig through it. And if he's a fraud, well, yeah, again, a lot of his behavior doesn't make sense with it. So
Yeah,
there's worthwhile
and that for
discussion
me,
there.
yeah, some of the correlations to ancient documents about Abraham, those are things which
Yeah.
like might cause me to have faith and go with the callous theory. And for me as well, the Book of Enoch, in the
Yeah.
Book of
Book of Enoch's
Moses,
great.
the correspondences with ancient documents with the Book of Enoch, particularly with what do you call it, the Book of Giants in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in Qumran, which Joseph wouldn't have had access to, and how many correspondences there are to the Book of Enoch, which I find quite astounding. And I've not found good evidence that he would have had access to the Book of Enoch. I know, I think it was Colby Townsend did an article about one Enoch and the possibility Joseph could have had access to it. But even then, I didn't find the correspondences that strong between one Enoch and um, Joseph's Book of Enoch, and I think it's really long as well. So for me, I would look at the Book of Enoch, and that might help me a little bit when it comes to say the Book of
Yeah.
Abraham. I feel like that
Yeah.
needs to
The
be taken into account.
if the Book of Abraham would not be a problem if Joseph wasn't convinced he actually had a document from Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like the Book of Enoch. We'd be like, oh,
I've
look at
written
all
by
these
his own hand on
Yeah, it would
papyrus.
actually probably be more of evidence towards the church if he. But since Joseph was so convinced he actually did have writings from Abraham, that's what makes it an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
he was literally translating. So yeah, it's going to be a big topic. I think you're exploring it for your CS ladder
yeah,
series. I'm going to do it at some stage next year. So I think it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to diving in.
yeah, it's good to it's a good one to learn about, and there's a lot about it. So, polygamy. You got any thoughts?
Let's do it. So polygamy, I'll be honest. I don't like trying to defend polygamy. I don't like the doctrine of polygamy. Like it just seems kind of like wrong or unfair, like to women that men can have more than one wife. So I think just the fact that like polygamy is doctrine and that it's part of our history, I think that's bothersome to people. But then I think certainly Joe Smith's practice of polygamy, there are areas which are troubling. I think sometimes critics might embellish things or make it sound more worse than maybe what it is. But like I can understand people being concerned about it being practiced very secretly. Emma not being aware of many of his early marriages. The polyandry, I think it's very unclear whether or not. To me, I would lean more towards they seem to be ceilings. I don't think there's evidence that they were consummated, but I can't say that for certain. And there's different theories. The critics would say, well, he was doing that so he could hide his polygamy in case he got them pregnant. That's why he was marrying other men's wives. The Brian Hale sort of theory is that he was trying to obey the command of the angel while not going the full way, and that's why. I think we're all kind of like speculating as to it, but I think
Yeah,
it's quite apparent that I think some of the marriages were ceilings. I would lean that way with Helen Mar Kimball. I think the evidence leans towards that was an eternity sealing, that it likely wasn't consummated. But I think definitely some of the marriages were, and there are things that bother me, like some of the proposals to some of the teenage girls. That bothers me a bit. I remember the episode on the Nancy Rigdon happiness ladder, and I could understand why somebody might view it as he seems to be trying to persuade her into uh, entering into a polygamous marriage with him, and the denials of polygamy as well. So I can understand why some of that seems troubling. I think if I'm validating, I think there's room for someone to interpret it as he's a sexual predator and taking advantage of being a prophet. I do think there's a little bit more nuance because I think they did view it as a religious practice, a doctrine. I don't think it was as simple as he's just jumping from bed to bed and he was all libido driven, if that makes sense. But obviously, there's no time machine. I can't go back. But yeah, I think it's messy. There's things which concern me. I think sometimes critics might, say things which maybe aren't factually accurate. Like, he was a pedophile, having sex with 14-year-olds, sending loads of men on missions to marry their wives. I think we need to be a little bit more on point with the data.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I don't like polygamy. Um, I don't like polygamy as a theology. I don't like it as a practice. I think it stinks. It bothers me that it's part of our history. We'd probably be a much bigger and better church if we never practiced polygamy in the first place. So it's unfortunate, but for whatever reason, God cares about it. And I think that's a fact that we all have to realize. God wanted it practiced, and so it was practiced by Joseph. My personal philosophical theory for this is I believe, and it's pretty basic, but I believe there will be more women who qualify for the next steps in our plan of salvation than there will be for men. And part of that next steps is that they will have to be married. And so I think this is just an expectation that God wants dispensational prophets to practice. So when we get to these next steps in the plan of salvation, it's not just like whoa, this is something that's going on. It's like, no, this is an expectation he's been giving us from the Bible times all the way to Joseph Smith. Doesn't mean it's the ideal. I think the ideal is monogamy. It's just it's something we have to have expectations for. And maybe in later steps in the plan of salvation, it'll all figure out and everyone will be monogamous. Or maybe there'll be people who are perfectly happy in a polygamous marriage. They're happy with it. So I won't be a polygamist in the next life. And I don't think the vast majority of people will be, but I do think that might be a role. When it comes to Joseph's practice of it, there are things that I find genuinely disturbing, and there are also things where
there's things which are just, even if you look at it in the best way, that he's a prophet, he was commanded, he received a revelation of the doctrine. There's even some things where it's like he could have practiced and implemented this better than what he did.
And I'm not in the business of excusing Joseph Smith. I think he was a normal human being who had a very hard thing to do, and he made some bad decisions. I think Emma even made some bad decisions when she pushed people down the stairs, with one of his wives. I think everyone made poor decisions with polygamy, and it was a hard thing to do. And it's a very emotional thing to grapple with. When I look at the evidence, I think Joseph Smith tried polygamy with Fanny Alger. I lean that was an attempt at polygamy. I think it was a bad attempt because he didn't get Emma's consent. And
with Fanny Alger, I would lean towards, as I did a video on it, irregardless of whether I believe polygamy is of God, bracketing that to the side, I felt like the evidence was quite strong in my view, that I lean towards there was some sort of a marriage ceremony. Even if Joseph just invented polygamy, I still believe there was some sort of a marriage ceremony. I don't believe it was just an adulterous affair. I understand you just listen to what Oliver has to say, and someone else, I can't remember who it was, and you might lean that way, but then you look at other people, I think like Eliza R. Snow and Uzziah Hancock and somebody else talk about there being a marriage ceremony.
Yeah, I think it was an attempt at marriage, and I think Joseph mishandled it. And I don't know I'm sure him and Emma had conversations. I want to be charitable to Joseph and Emma. I'm sure they had conversations, and those conversations didn't go well. And then he made an attempt at it, and then that blew up in his face. So he didn't try again for 3 years. And then the next time he tries, we see Don Bradley's research. It looks like it's with pregnant women. And during that day, maybe that was an attempt at polygamy in a way to be like, I don't want to have sex, but I want to appease this commandment from God. And so he's marrying pregnant women because he didn't have sexual relations. But then I think that becomes problematic. And then he starts marrying more and more people. And obviously it gets, eventually it gets to the point where polygamy is just almost like a social thing rather than like marriages they're just getting sealed, but they're not living together. It just becomes a theological thing rather than like a social. That's my take on polygamy. I think he's a reluctant polygamist. Eventually just gets to the point where it just rips the Band-Aid off and people get married to each other, and it's complex and they're figuring it out.
And there's some parts in D&C 132, we didn't talk about that I can see some of the warnings towards Emma, why it's bothersome to people. And I think, there's some strong language in there. I think the tough thing with D&C 132, because I know Patrick Mason said he's not a fundamentalist, so he sort of just rejects polygamy. What I find difficult with that is I feel like in that revelation there's a lot about just celestial marriage as well, and talking about like
Yeah.
sealing and stuff. So I feel like if
Yeah.
you throw out plural marriage, it's like, but what about like sealings and celestial marriage? I feel like they're very much intertwined. I think that's probably part of the reasons why it's hard for the church to fully leave polygamy behind, because of so much in D&C 132 is about
Yeah.
celestial internal marriage.
Yeah. And I think it's important with polygamy in context. Like, everyone talks about how it's like motivated by sex. I think that's very, very false. I think when we look at it, the evidence for sexuality, we only have like 5 to 8 spouses that like there's really some evidence, and everyone else like not great.
Yeah.
And
I
we
suppose
look at that
critics they'll
He
always
didn't
say
have
like,
any
oh well,
kids.
you know,
Yeah.
even if they're not stating it, they could still have been having sex if they're married. But
Yeah.
I know what you mean, like, because I think I did a video on it, and there's only, yeah, probably 5 to 8, which is like either some sort of a statement that they were intimate with Joseph.
Yeah. And even the statements are a little they have some ambiguity in them, all those statements. But then he has no kids with any of the polygamous wives. So obviously, this is not, if there is sexual relations among a few, it's not
Abortion.
happening. Um, yeah,
John P.
it's not
Bennett did
happening.
it.
Yeah, abortions, that's a crazy theory, but it's not happening frequently. And I don't think it's sexually driven in the slightest. I don't think that's a great argument. So that's my
Actually,
take.
one last thought. Sorry, we're going a little bit long on this one. I remember I read this quote, and the first time I found it, it was in my polygamy series, and it really did strike me. And it was the son of William Law, I believe. I think this might be late. I don't know if it's firsthand. I can't remember, but I remember he said that he saw William Law and Joseph Smith having like a conversation, and it was very emotional. And William Law was basically begging Joseph to stop the practice of polygamy. So obviously Joseph had told him at this point, and basically was like, this is going to destroy the church, like begging him, like, please don't do this. And he was crying, and Joseph was crying, and Joseph was saying like, I wish I could, but like I've been commanded. It's a true principle, and we must practice it. And I remember Richard, I think his name was Richard Law, the son of William Law, said that Joseph seemed very sincere and earnest in this conversation. Now you could say, well, he was just pretending and a good actor, but I feel like there's some validity to that. Like, I could see that exchange happening, and that Joseph was sincere and earnest, following this command, to restore this practice and this principle. And
Yeah.
that was something that kind of I take into account as well, and also the testimonies of people who claim to have spiritual experiences and spiritual confirmations or see an
Yeah.
angel. Like, I know you
Yeah. We
could
have
say
that
like,
with
well, that
Lucy
might happen.
Walker.
Yeah, Lucy Walker. I think, who was it? Was it Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner who claimed to see the same angel that Joseph saw? And like people might say like, oh well, people in Warren Jeff's group might have had spiritual experiences, but I think you need to take that into account as well.
Yeah.
So
And I think there's a good point, and it's a little controversial, but I'm a big fan of when it comes to like situations of believing women. I think we should always believe women. And I think that also applies to Joseph Smith. Plenty of the women defended him. They defended his character. And I
that's a good
think,
point.
and I don't like what a lot of people do where they just, they just like kind of like trash on these women, or like, oh, they were just manipulated. They're too stupid. They don't know what they're talking about. And I'm like, no, these were intelligent, great women, and we should believe them. We should listen to them. And not all of them loved polygamy, but they all defended Joseph Smith and defended his character. And I think they deserve to be listened to. That's
Yeah,
my
that's a good
my final thought
observation.
there.
So polygamy, I think it's either A or B, because I think there's a little bit of nuance to it. I wouldn't
When it
fully agree.
comes to uncomfortability, I definitely would put it in an A. When it comes to its effect on truth claims, it's like in a D,
Well,
because it
yeah,
has no
truth
effect on the
claims is
truth claims of the
different.
church.
Yeah,
But it's uncomfortable.
yeah.
But it has no effect on the truth claims of the church, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, I don't know, you put it.
We'll go with B.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting near the end. We'll go with Freemasonry next.
Yeah, Freemasonry. You have any thoughts on Freemasonry?
So whenever I first saw the connections between like the Temple Endowment and Freemasonry, and that Joseph, a couple of months before, the Temple Endowment was practiced, he became a Freemason. I think he became like a Master Mason, and it's undisputed like there are parallels and connections between the Endowment and Masonry.
Oh yeah,
The
very
rituals,
strong.
the wording, like, and that's not a secret. Like, I think the early leaders and saints saw him as he's restoring masonry. Masonry is like the corrupted endowment.
Yeah,
So whenever I first learned about it, I thought like this is a big issue. He's plagiarizing, he's borrowing from masonry and putting his own spin on it. And I think there's two apologetics you could go. One apologetic is that there's a difference between the endowment and the what's the word? Perform? No, not performance. The presentation of the endowment. That's the word. And that the endowment is the covenants, it's the doctrine, and then that is just how it is presented, is in the
yeah,
ritual, and God is working through masonry, essentially, and that it's not so much about the Masonic elements as it is about the covenants and such. I remember at the time when I was first in my faith crisis, I wasn't fully convinced by that apologetic because I was like, again, it's indistinguishable from him just borrowing everything and then putting his own spin on it, sort of thing. And like critics would say, like he's always taking from his environment and milieu. But what for me, and this is something I shared in my story, one the first apologetic evidences that I was like, like this is new to me, was seeing some of the strong correspondences and correlations between the temple endowment and like ancient temple rites, like ancient Egyptian temple rituals, early Christian temple rites, even like the coronation ceremony of monarchs or like priests in the Old Testament, and like they would wear, garments with marks on it, and there would be robes, and like some of the early Christians, like the Gnostics, would engage in like prayer circles and make covenants, and there would be like hand clasps and things. I can't remember all the specific correspondences, but there was a lot to where I was like, there's a lot of things in here which is very similar to our temple endowment, and some things which there isn't a connection between masonry and the temple endowment, but there is between like these ancient temple rites and our endowment. I remember at the time thinking, we go through the endowment to become kings and priests unto God. Like all the clothing that we wear, the rituals, the oaths that we make is very similar to an ancient priest or a monarch making covenants and what they go through in a ritual. And I saw the symbolism. I remember thinking at the time, as an unbeliever, that, someone could make an argument that I don't know exactly how Freemasonry connects to these things, but that Joseph Smith could be restoring these ancient temple rites. Like, I saw some ancient antiquity to it, and since
yeah,
then I've totally seen the temple endowment in a different way, because I used to think it was creepy. It made no sense to me. It was just this weird Masonic culty ritual that we do, and that's totally changed the way that I see it. I don't know if you have any
yeah.
thoughts to add.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think there's good evidence that Freemasonry, not as a group, dates anciently, but some of their rituals and practices have ancient Christian origins.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of good research there and how those things also show up in the endowment. Those are the ancient things that show up in the endowment. So I think there's good evidence there. And if that's the case, and Joseph joins Masonry, and by revelation he finds these ancient things and then incorporates it into the endowment, I think that's a pretty good case to make. I also think there's an interesting case to make, and I don't know if it's the route I go, but I may go in the future of like, let's say the restoration happened on a Polynesian island, and the endowment is actually like, you know how like they do rituals of coming of age and getting tattoos and certain things,
Mm-hmm.
and that the endowment, when the endowment shows up when the restoration on Polynesian island, that is part of the endowment ceremony, is getting these like tattoos and rituals. I could see that being the case, and like it's just Freemasonry is just a part of the culture, and it was a way for to make making covenants with God to make it culturally significant, and it just comes out of the culture of the people. So right now, I probably take the idea that there's ancient elements to Freemasonry, but if it turns out it's the other case where God is just using a part of culture to add significance to a ceremony of making covenants, that wouldn't bother me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also, we've seen changes to the endowment. They've removed some of the
Yeah,
death oath penalties people used to make, or the 5 points of fellowship. And even since I've been endowed, like there's been some small changes. The women don't have to veil their faces, or
yeah.
covenant to obey their husband. I noticed those things, and again, going back, if you have this, like I had this view of the endowment, this is like literal word for word. Like, this is how it happened. So I was like, how can you change the temple endowment? How could there be changes? But I think, with the restoring of the temple endowment, there would have been Masonic elements in there as well, which aren't essential to be in there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. So I don't know.
I
What do you
think
think ranking it?
for me personally, and this is just my opinion, it would probably be let's see your tier list, a D for me.
Yeah, I agree. I'm
You
with
agree?
you right in D.
Okay, sweet.
So
Last
last
one,
up is prophets.
prophets. It's a big one. So, well, I think there's like a couple of issues with prophets, but kind of like encompassing it all is like prophetic fallibility, that prophets aren't perfect. And I grew up and I didn't believe that prophets were morally perfect, right? Like, I believe they could,
Yeah.
lose their temper, be impatient or sinful. Obviously, there are limits to what I would think of a prophet. I definitely did have them on this pedestal.
Yeah,
I
me
would
too.
have viewed the apostles and prophets like every week they're meeting with Jesus in the temple, or when the prophet goes to Holy Holies, he is seeing Jesus and the message he's given at conference, that is word for word what the Lord would want us to hear. And I also would have had this view that like prophets will never lead you astray, so there wouldn't be any doctrinal or theological mistakes, or like it wasn't part of my worldview of a prophet that they could teach false doctrine. So learning about maybe Brigham Young teaching Adam God theory or blood atonement or the priesthood ban upon blacks and some of the racist teachings that blacks had the curse of Cain, that was really troubling to me. And even if you look at the November 2015 policy on the children of LGBT parents, and that was sort of a policy and claimed as a revelation, but then 4 years later, it was overturned. And I would look at that, and if you have this view that a prophet can never be wrong, that I don't know how you could make it work. I don't think you could, because I think there are clear signs in our history where prophets have been wrong. There's been false doctrine, and there's so many other things you could point to. Um, so I think that can be a big issue for people when they're brought up that prophets will never lead you astray, or that they're doctrinally inerrant.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you there. I think that's one of the biggest causes of faith crisis today is bad expectations about a prophet and their fallibility. And we do ourselves no favors when we teach people to have very poor expectations when it comes to giving them expectations that prophets are always speaking in connection with God. That's just a recipe to set up for a faith crisis eventually, which is like me and you. It has happened to me and you,
Oh yeah, for
and
me,
plenty
this
of
was
other people.
probably, if I were to label my top three, top five biggest issues, this was definitely one of them. And this has still been something I've had to wrestle with, because I think the obvious follow up question to someone who views not just like prophets, but like, say, the scriptures are inerrant, like infallible, perfect word for word, is like, if they can be wrong sometimes, then it begs the question, well, how do I know when they're right? And then
Yeah,
the whole question of like, what if my personal revelation is telling me this? The prophets are saying this, and they're claiming this is the mind and will of the Lord. But if Brigham Young was wrong in the past about this, then what if they're wrong now? And it can open this can of worms where it's like, well, what do I follow then? If they can be
yeah,
wrong, are they fully reliable?
yeah. In my mind, I see three different ways. One, that prophets have always been right. This is an approach that I don't like, but a lot of people take, and they find ways
I
to
feel like it doesn't
justify
work.
everything and make sense. It doesn't make sense to me, but some people, I know some accounts that are really shallow and they take that
Yeah.
approach, and I'm not a fan of it.
I just
Um,
wonder how they would make sense of, clear false doctrine, or when the church has said, yeah, this was false doctrine, like Adam God
yeah,
theory, or we disavowed those racist theories of the past.
yeah. There's that route, and then there's the route of like the ongoing restoration. This is a new thing that we're seeing in the church, and it's been getting a lot of traction fairly recently,
Yeah, I
especially among
suppose,
the
yeah.
Orthodox crowd. It's the idea that like almost that God has taught in like um, small portions, and over time throughout councils and everything, we've refined in the church to get to where we are today,
Right, line upon line, further
and
light and
line upon
knowledge.
line. And that's a great route. I know a lot of good people who take that route, and that was the route I probably took when I first came back to the church. But
Mm-hmm.
the question for me comes down to, was the priesthood ban inspired or not? That's the very big question, and it has a lot of baggage on how we answer that question. Because if it wasn't inspired, then for whatever reason, for about 100 years, God didn't correct it.
Yeah.
And obviously, prophets prayed, he didn't correct it. And so we have to come to some very uncomfortable realizations of how God is actually involved in the church if we believe the priesthood ban is not inspired. If we believe it is inspired, well, there's a lot of problems with that too. And there's a lot of really strong evidence it wasn't inspired. There's a lot of really good logic it wasn't inspired. Um, and so, yeah, you have to take the route of, was the priesthood ban inspired or not? I believe the priesthood ban was not inspired, and it
Yeah.
forces me to
I agree with you.
grapple with the data that God might not be as involved as I grew up believing that he was in the church.
Yeah.
And so the route I have built for myself, and this is where I would almost describe myself as a little bit fundamental in the church, is I believe that God came down and he taught Joseph correct principles through the Book of Mormon, through the Doctrine and Covenants, through the theology that Joseph Smith was giving, but it has since, for the most part, with exception, has allowed the church to govern itself. I see that this is the route that I think the evidence goes. It's an uncomfortable route for a lot of people, and it may be a little bit of an apostate an apostate route. But it's the route I go. It makes the most sense to me. I just can't grapple with the fact, well, one, the priesthood ban, but also that we don't really see revelations since Joseph Smith. We don't see new theological expansions, new doctrines. I just don't see a lot of that stuff happening in the church.
Yeah.
And so that's the way I grapple with it, is the correct principles and a sense of how the church governs itself. But with that said, that's an uncomfortable route for a lot of people. The ongoing restoration route can work. I know Dan Ellsworth has a lot of good work on this, and he has videos explaining the ongoing restoration. I think there's good logic to it. It just falls a little short for me, but that's just me
Yeah.
personally.
And this is just my personal opinion. I don't even know if this is like an apologetic, but where I would lean is believing that they have the authority, the keys to preside, that they can receive revelation, that they can be inspired, um, but that not everything they say is the mind and will of God. That I'm not saying that they definitely haven't seen Jesus or had visions. I lean towards that's probably more rare than common for the most part. But I believe, and this is my own subjective spiritual experiences, that there has been certain talks, BYU devotionals, which have just been very inspired to me, which seem to be answered to
Mm-hmm.
prayers, which seem to be like, I believe that God inspired them. Now, I don't believe every single word came from God, and there might even be a wee element in the talk where I was like, well, I'm not feeling that, but I believe they can be inspired. Similar to myself, where there's times where I believe I've received revelation, I've been inspired at times, that I have that same access to God, but that it's not always a constant thing, and that
Yeah.
they also have agency, they also have their own biases, they're trying to interpret things, they're trying to discern revelation, and it's kind of messy, but that error will creep in as well, and
Yeah.
that revelation isn't always as direct as we might want it to be, and it makes it more complex. But I couldn't, I feel like I can't go back to the simple view that prophets will never lead you astray and always teach the truth when you can show things in history. And I think there's just more nuance. But then you could go to the other extreme where, like, well, then you can't trust anything and all of it's wrong. And I feel like there's a bit of nuance there, but it's still something
Yeah.
which I wrestle with to an extent, and I've had to
Yeah.
become comfortable with still sustaining them and believing in inspiration and revelation while acknowledging that there can be errors and
Yeah.
mistakes.
Yeah, and I think sustain just means to support and endure. It does not mean agree. That's a
Yeah,
bad misconception we get. It just means to support and endure, and I absolutely support. And I also endure some of the things I see church leadership do, and that's okay. It's just part of being a part of the restoration. Um,
yeah. Like I've a wee bee in my bonnet. I talk about this with Jacob Hansen. And everyone's gonna think, Mark, you just want to drink alcohol, tea, and coffee, you Irishman. But I have an issue with the word of wisdom being a strict commandment. No, I'm not
yeah,
out
me
there
too.
protesting. I'm not, and it's not even that I desperately want to try. Like I would like the freedom, but it's more the fact that like the revelation was more not by way of strict commandment, not quite as simple as like in moderation, but like certain things wasn't like strict as abstinence. And I sort of view the word of wisdom being a commandment, like attached to fellowship, as like I see it more as policy than I do see it as like doctrine. And I
Yeah,
sort of feel like
yeah,
they could change that, and I almost feel like they should, because it bothers me that say somebody drank the occasional cup of tea or coffee, but is like super Christ-like person can't be baptized or say get
yeah,
a temple recognition like that logically I struggle with that, and I'm like, this is my opinion. I'm not claiming any divine revelation, but that's just kind of how I feel. But I'm not gonna leave the church over it. But that's just something where I might have a difference of opinion.
yeah, and I agree with you. I think the original word of wisdom was right, and I think we might be a little off with how we do it now, with it
And like
being like
maybe
strict.
they've received some divine inspiration or mandate from God as to why we have this change. I do think there is some sensibility, or it makes some sense against like smoking or drugs, you know, because they can be
Yeah,
addicted. Like I do get some of it why it's like strict abstinence, but it's also the, I don't know, you don't have the agency, you know,
yeah,
to act for yourself.
yeah. And when it comes to like this question of prophets and how is involved, how much God is involved with them, one thing I also believe is I believe really powerfully in the phrase one by one, and how that's how we see how Christ ministers to people one by one. And so after I believe God taught Joseph those correct principles that we still protect and govern in the church today, I believe he goes and after that, he is now working one by one through humanity, through membership of the church. And so when I hear someone in general conference speaking, it's not that I think God had come down and is like, this is what the church needs, but that God, one by one, through that general authority, has been teaching him those things that they can share wisdom for us. And for sometimes, for situations, that talk is going to very much apply to me, and it's going to be very profound and important to me. For other people, it might not.
Yeah,
And I think that's okay. And I also think it's more than okay to disagree sometimes. Like Dallin H. Oaks said, 3 degrees in the celestial kingdom in general conference this last conference. I don't agree with him. I don't think there's 3 degrees in the celestial kingdom for a variety of reasons. And that's okay. It didn't make me have anxiety. It didn't make me have a panic attack when he
you have
said
to
that.
leave
I
the
was like,
church.
I'm like, it's okay. I don't quite agree with that. And it's like, it's not the end of the world to disagree from time to time. And
Yeah,
I think that's a lesson that a
I
lot of
think
people
sometimes
can
in the church we
get
almost
okay
feel
with.
like we all have to agree, or else
Yeah.
like there's going to be contention or division. Like you must be in line. This is the official doctrine. Like even small things, like
Yeah.
me and my wife have differences when we talk about like, will we eat food in the celestial kingdom? And I'm like, well, heck yeah, Jesus ate food with his disciples with a resurrected body. I think we'll eat food. She's like, no, we won't need food. And like we had the difference of opinion, but I'm like, it doesn't really matter, you know?
Yeah. And just because I disagreed with Down H. Oaks on the 3 degrees in Celestial Kingdom doesn't mean I'm going to like go and like start a freaking riot and go to church headquarters and start picketing and advocating for them to like, no, it's okay to disagree from time to time. It's okay to even be like express disagreements without being an advocate or without trying to like push on changes that aren't in our jurisdiction to make. It just means that you're a critically thinking human, and you might come to a different conclusion from time to time. And that's just part of being a membership and part of being in the membership of the church. And it's okay. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah, and I think this is a question that most people at some point will have to grapple with.
Mm-hmm.
Either if they learn something about the history or some sort of a policy change, which, or you know, some sort of position the church takes, which doesn't align with the way they feel about something. I think they
Yeah.
will encounter that at some point, and it's something that I think we kind of have to wrestle with.
Yeah. And there are a few things that bother me more than when I see like faithful accounts who are just like very shallowly just like follow the prophet's always right. And it's just like if people there's a lot of people leaving the church today, and this is at a lot of times at the heart of the issue. Um and it's like I just feel like it's not no one's testimony is being saved by saying
By saying that,
follow the prophet, he's right, read his conference talk 10 more times because you didn't quite understand it. Like if we really want to help people who are struggling with the faith, give people real expectations, you know? Say it's okay to disagree from time to time. It's okay. to be a critically thinking human and not just be a sheep who agrees with everything they hear from the pulpit. Like that's how we're going to really help people, not just this shallow, frustrating primary song
Yeah,
apologetics that I'm seeing so frequently in the LDS sphere.
because like from a pure factual standpoint, like I logically could not go back to prophets will never be wrong. Like maybe they
Yeah,
won't lead the church astray in a huge way, but like believing that like they will never be wrong about doctrine or revelation, I
yeah,
could never go back to that belief because to me it just seems factual
yeah.
that that's happened in our history. You know?
Yeah, and the astray thing is a whole conversation, but I think astray requires intention. I think that's the way it was originally used. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for example, I don't think you, Stephen, are ever going to lead me astray in your content. All the content you make, I don't think you're going to lead me astray. Now, that's not saying I don't think you're going to make mistakes or like maybe you're not going to like have we're going to have differences, but I don't think you're ever going to go in and try to like harm my testimony or put me down a rabbit hole that's like I'm not going to get out of. That's
Mm-hmm.
not what I mean. What I mean, I don't think you're going to lead me astray. I don't think you're going to intentionally try to deceive me. That's how I
Yeah.
interpret the phrase "never lead astray." So I still hold to that principle. But if you were to force me, it means no mistakes, and I wouldn't hold to it anymore.
Yeah. So where are we gonna rank this? I'm thinking maybe B. It's a tough one. Like
For me, it has no the prophets and the
in terms of
it
truth
has
claims, it doesn't have a
yeah
bearing on.
it's a kind of an F for me in truth claims because it has nothing to do with Joseph having ancient metal plates. But
In terms of
when
like
it
an
comes to
issue for
uncomfortable,
faith,
I would say a C maybe, but you put it where you want. There's a lot in B.
let's see, we'll go B.
Okay, there we go. You're much nicer than I am.
All right. Well,
Well, good.
I think this has been a really good episode. I'll probably have to wrap up soon because time for dinner here. My wife is getting hungry, but I think this has been really fun to talk about some of these different issues and to sort of give our thoughts on it. Apologies, listeners, if you're not happy with where we place some of them, or if you felt like obviously we couldn't talk about every single thing when it comes to each topic, but we've tried to give our, in a nutshell, sort of representing the criticism and our thoughts on it. And I think it's been really fun to collaborate. It's been far too long in waiting for this to happen, so it's been good to meet up. So thanks
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on, Bridger. Oh, I have one last question to ask you because you're a tennis fan. Who is the GOAT?
Um, what do you mean by that question? Like, are we talking skill wise or just achievement wise?
So, well, I think we know who is the GOAT statistically. That's kind of
Yeah, it's
almost hard to
obvious.
dispute now, but who is the GOAT in terms of elegance, in
Pure
terms of
dominance in tennis.
talent?
I would say GOAT isn't when it comes to just like a tennis player, like just dominance in the sport. I would say Rafael Nadal. When we look at the injuries that he's had throughout his career, when we look at the numbers when it comes to his statistics and how he places in tournaments, I think if you gave Nadal the body of Djokovic, I don't even think it'd be a conversation. I think Nadal would be considered by virtually every person on the planet the GOAT of tennis. But since Djokovic, and this is part of the sport, has the better body, he's taken better care of his body, he's been healthier.
That's
He
true.
is the GOAT of tennis. He is
Yeah.
the GOAT. But if we apply a little nuance, I think Rafael Nadal
Yeah, to be
is
fair
the
to
GOAT.
Rafa, he has had more injuries. He's certainly the king of clay. See, to me, in terms of elegance, in terms of just talent, skill, and I'm biased because Roger Federer was always my childhood hero. I wanted to emulate his one-handed
Oh
backhand.
yeah,
But I know statistically, I'm like, okay, he's not the GOAT anymore. Like,
yeah,
Djokovic is on, 24 slams? He's probably going to win a few more. He's won each Masters 1000 twice. He's been world number one for the most amount of weeks. He's got a win. I think he's
yeah,
got a head to head. He's winning the head to head against Rafa and Roger. So I'm like, yeah, he's statistically
yeah.
he's the GOAT, but I
And
still
it's
want Roger to
unfortunate
be the
because
GOAT.
like Djokovic dominated in a time like in the last couple of years when like there really wasn't anyone to compete with him. Where Rafa, all of his wins come from like the hardest era of tennis, and that's why I think Rafa had like if we're applying nuance to it, I think Rafa's a little better because Rafa's get his tournaments from Roger and when Djokovic were at their peak. Where Djokovic got all his tournaments when Rafa was hurt and Roger was done. You know,
Mm.
so
I don't know.
that's
I don't know
my
because
that's my
I still
Djokovic
think that
beef,
Djokovic
but
had to rise to like his peak because even like
that's
2011,
true.
2012, I still think Rafa and Roger were still at a pretty good level. So I might push back on you there, but Well,
Yeah.
this could be a separate podcast talking about.
I'd go all into it, but yeah.
But no, go check out again Bridger's TikTok channel and his YouTube channel. It's called Actual Mormon. That's right.
Actual Mormons is the YouTube channel.
Actual Mormons.
The podcast I'm doing, yeah.
Awesome. It's been really fun collaborating. I've really enjoyed this time talking about your story and doing this. And maybe in the future we can collaborate on different topics or things. So we'll definitely keep in touch. And listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, give it a like, share with other people, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. Comment underneath your thoughts on our tier list. What would be your tier list? How would you rank some of these topics? And we'll see you in the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.